Heinz Guderian's Achtung Panzer is often thought of as the ultimate book on tank warfare. It was supremely influential on Germany's tactical and doctrinal thought during World War II. It was written in 1937 to inspire Germany's generals and veterans, and ensure that Germany invested properly in the various forces that Guderian thought would win the next war. It starts off with the history of World War I and the early development of tanks. It then moves on to the current state of German armored and mechanized forces. It concludes with the tactical and operational innovations and methods thought of by Guderian to maximize offensive power. I assure you that the historical prelude and tank development are important to Guderian's concept of tank warfare and how all nations will use tanks in the next war. Now we will go over a timeline of Guderian's life and important events. Heinz Guderian was born in June 1888 in Prussia. In 1907, he was sent out as an uncommissioned ensign cadet. In 1914, World War I breaks out. In February 1916, the British successfully test a tank. Combat in World War I ends in 1918. June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is signed restricting Germany's army, navy, and air forces. October 1922, Soviets win the Russian Civil War. January 1933, the Nazis seize power. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War rages from October 1935 to May 1936. Between 1936 and 1940, the four-year plan for Germany is executed. The Spanish Civil War lasts from July 1936 to April 1939. And September 1st, 1939, World War II starts. In 1940 is the invasion of France. June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa is launched. And in May 8th, 1945, is Victory in Europe Day. 1914 and positional warfare. Heinz Guderian talks about how the nations of Europe had very old notions of how the cavalry were educated, equipped, and trained. They were still adhering to the battle tactics of von Seydlitz, who was Frederick the Great's cavalry commander. The armies ignored technological developments and paid the price in blood. Heinz Guderian points out how the French had far superior artillery to the Germans and had way more ammunition than the Germans could muster. The Germans had an advantage from the heavy guns, which were initially highly effective and surprising to the French. As the war progressed, the quantity of artillery increased, more ammunition was gathered, and more elderly models of artillery were put to work. Heinz Guderian's thoughts on trench warfare and barbed wire. The barbed wire constantly increased in density and depth. Little use was made of rearward positions at first, and the engineers gained significance because they had to put up the wire and create plans to take down the enemy's wire. There was also complicated work fording rivers and blowing up fortified positions. Waging war with inadequate weaponry. 1. The artillery combat. The French attacked Champagne to break German lines of communication. The artillery planned to play a considerably greater role. The French failed to bring 3 attacking corps into action simultaneously, causing fighting to break up into individual actions, and the Germans used every pause in the offensive to launch powerful counterattacks. The numbers of the battle stood at this. The French had 155,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and 819 guns. Against the Germans, 81,000 infantry, 3,700 cavalry, 470 guns. The French made only meager gains. The takeaway is this. The French attacked a fortress which was unlimited in breadth and depth. The assaulting infantry made slow headway, which gave the enemy a chance to lay out new defenses behind those positions. The French suffered heavy casualties in Champagne. Guderian called this the first artillery battle of the war. German Third Army did quite well despite poor equipment, and despite courage and superiorities in number and ammunition, the French still failed to break through positions. 2. Gas warfare. Guderian says gas warfare first came into use in February 1915 with French-employed rifle gas grenades against the Germans. Here, I think Guderian is doing historical revisionism to justify German gas warfare. The first implementation was actually by the Germans at Ypres. Chemical weapons had 2 forms, gas shells and gas cylinders. Gas shells were not very effective. A lot was left to be desired from gas shells. The Germans did not have enough propellant charges to effectively launch the gas into French trenches on a mass scale. Instead, gas cylinders were used by being planted in batteries and forward trenches. However, they relied on wind as a major drawback. The genesis of the tank. British tanks. The first tanks were developed in Great Britain. The first model was the Holt Caterpillar tractor. The running gear was an endless track, and this machine had the potential to crush obstacles under trenches and convey its armament under bulletproof protection. Communication was only practiced by using small discs and flags. French tanks. Independently of the British, the French rapidly hit on the notion of powered vehicles for crushing barbed wire. French engineers tried to convert the Flitz tractor to a machine gun carrier, but cross-country performance was disappointing. French High Command placed an order for 400 vehicles. In June 1916, French High Command learned the British were also building tanks. Colonel Estienne went to England to coordinate. Estienne divided vehicles into batteries of 4 tanks each. 4 batteries formed a group under a captain. Several such groups constituted a groupement. Battle success and failure. The original thickness of armor was proof against ordinary German S round, but not armor-piercing SMK rounds. Tracks were too narrow and exerted excessive ground pressure. The tanks dug into the soft ground and became stuck. The French tanks had inadequate cross-country mobility. The supporting infantry rendered virtually no help. Armor hadn't met expectations. 57 tanks were knocked out by artillery fire, 15 were killed through direct fire, and 37 through indirect fire. Starting with tactical doctrine, tanks should not be used in driblets, or penny packets as Guderian calls it, but they were. The British gave away the element of surprise by deploying tanks before they had a large number of tanks, or a planned doctrinal use. The British wanted to acquire experience before placing orders for more tanks. This went against what the French had recommended. The French wanted to wait till they had their own tanks ready, and you can imagine how this created tension between the Allies. The tanks should have moved in a deployed formation because it would have made it more difficult for the Germans to hold off. The tanks should have attacked earlier to cooperate with the infantry. The barrage was an obstacle in the way of a rapid advance by the tanks. Guderian states that there needs to be explored other forms of artillery support. A breakthrough would have been possible with a more effective deployment of tanks. More French deductions from their experiments were these. Tanks became effective against fortified positions only after they had crossed the zone of craters. Flanking units were particularly vulnerable and need special protection. Tank attacks must be carried out in depth. Objectives should be assigned to whole units. Communications failed with their meager system of discs and flags. Tanks are liable to heavy losses when standing still, and close cooperation with the infantry proved its worth. The birth of a new weapon. In 1917, the British were facing off against the Germans who were strongly fortified in the Hindenburg Line. The British decided to now attack the Hindenburg Line with their British tanks, now deployed over wide stretches kilometers in length. The attack was spearheaded by the tanks. The attack now flooded over like at Flesquerie. Success would have been greater if their tank attack had been endowed with greater depth. The British should have eliminated the batteries, reserves, and HQ in one blow by the Air Force. The Versailles Dictate. This chapter goes over the limitations on the German Army, Navy, and Air Force. Basically, the Army is banned from building tanks, chemical weapons, and is limited to a small size. The Navy cannot build U-boats, and Germany cannot have a military air force. This section is largely for Guderian to complain about the harsh treatment of Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. Post-war developments. Firstly, technical developments post-war. There was an increasing specialization of tanks for swimming, radio communication, command, bridge laying, and mine plows. 2-axle, then 3-axle, and then 4th-axle drives were made. Pneumatic-type steering was extended to all wheels in some designs. Secondly, the tactical and organizational developments post-war. The British concluded to separate tank assaults from that of the infantry. They wanted to deliver a mass attack at surprise, using speed of movement an exploitation of terrain and smoke screens with less danger from anti-tank defenses. The breakthrough became a real possibility, but tank forces will only gain a local tactical importance. In 1929, the British staff experimented with this formation of infantry brigades: a light tank battalion, a motor company, and 3 battalions of infantry, which may be transported on trucks. The test exercises revealed shortcomings. The tanks forfeited speed as a consequence of being tied so closely to the infantry. In 1932, all armored forces took field on exercise. A tank brigade of 1 light and 3 mixed battalions, 1 truck transported infantry brigades of 3 battalions, 1 armored recon detachment of 3 companies, 4 batteries of light artillery, 2 anti-aircraft batteries, 1 signals, 1 engineer, and 1 medical company, and a supply train command of this entrusted to a general with little to no experience with tanks. The French had a different path. The French began to experiment converting cavalry to a motorized force. Operational reconnaissance was discovered to be beyond the capability of mounted scouts. The answer lay in multi-wheeled armored recon vehicles. Armored recon was also deemed suitable for tactical half-tracks. The French created a new Type 32 cavalry division. The tank forces in Russia developed very differently. The Russians created 3 kinds of formations. 1. NPP, which was for immediate infantry support. 2. DPP, which was for long-range infantry support. And 3. DD for long-range forces. Higher numbers have heavier tanks. Guderian says there is something to be said of the Russian organization. Rapid and long-range tanks would operate in the enemy depth. Heavy tanks would do battle with enemy tanks, along with anti-tank weapons and artillery. Light tanks with machine guns would be used to clear infantry. However, their classification of tanks demand a large inventory of specialized tanks. However, this works well with the high amount of Russian industry. The German mechanized forces. Inspector General von Vollard recognized the inefficiency of training diverse settlements of mechanized forces as a single body, so he separated the tanks, motorcycles, trucks, and ambulances in their training. Operational reconnaissance and tactical reconnaissance doctrines are split and considered very differently. Operational reconnaissance is much farther range and should be conducted by the Air Force. Scouts must keep out of forces that follow them in regards to motorized infantry. The German army desires a modern, fast-moving force of infantry, possessing strong firepower, specially equipped, organized, and trained for permanent cooperation with tanks. Life in the Panzer Forces. The barracks will consist of both living spaces and workshops for tanks. The tank crew must work together very well. A special mechanized forces school will provide necessary knowledge and skill for tank operation and maintenance. Better for tank crews to combine mechanical knowledge and tactical knowledge. The tactics of the Panzer forces and their cooperation with the other arms. The tactics of the Panzer forces. The main tactical movement of the Panzer forces should be a concentrated surprise attack against a line of enemy field fortifications, aiming at a specific point where the terrain is favorable for deployment of tank breakthroughs. The deployment of mines by the enemy should also be taken into account. Clearing mines is done by engineers who should approach obstacles under the cover of darkness or fog. Engineers can be protected by artillery and machine gun fire. One of their primary jobs will be to clear lanes for tanks, but mine-plowing tanks could also be used. Anti-tank guns must be silenced or blinded by other weapons before or during the attack. When the tank attack is launched, other forces must then delay the intervention of anti-tank reserves and tanks. This can be done through aircraft or long-range artillery. The tanks will then get in fast and deep into the zone of command center. In addition to depth, the breakthrough attack also needs breadth in order to make it difficult for the enemy to bring the central axis under flanking fire. Here you can see that if the breakthrough's territory is too narrow, the tanks will be very vulnerable on the flank and will then get surrounded. If the breakthrough is widened, however, the enemy will have less knowledge of the inner defenses, and your forces can create better defenses. In summary of the past several paragraphs, a tank attack needs suitable terrain, surprise, concentration, breadth, and depth. Guderian also states that a good commander will stay in front during the attack. This is much more typical of German officers. Guderian himself would serve right at the front during the invasions of France and Russia in World War II. However, this principle costs a high number of officer casualties, which is disastrous if the war becomes prolonged. Cooperation with tanks and other arms. Inter-armed communication is a matter of fundamental importance. The French and British still regard the infantry as the bearer of victory or queen of the battlefield. They focus their attention on fire of heavy weapons which represent the immediate threat to the foot soldiers. The main function of the tank to them is to destroy heavy weapons. They forget that clearing the infantry can be accomplished by a handful of machine gun tanks. However, there is a third school of thought. Without departing from what is technically feasible, tanks can do something more than act as train bearers to infantry. This school is based on three principles. 1. That infantry are strong in the defensive, but their offensive capacity is feeble and slow acting. 2. That powerful artillery fire is insufficient to guarantee a break-in of the enemy battle zone. 3. That the existence of enemy motorized and armored reserves rules out the possibility of a decisive victory through conventional breakthrough tactics. Guderian advocates for achieving a sweeping victory by the third school, where tactical decisions are then exploited to the operational dimension by elevating the more mobile air and tank forces to the main arms of service. These steps can be broken down as: break through the enemy line, pursue enemy troops on the retreat, then roll up and destroy any intact sectors. This system will still allow for commanders on the ground to choose to pursue certain objectives. That is more important than imposing a rigid tactical framework. In a more detailed breakdown of steps and formations, the first line will pin down enemy reserves, including tanks and headquarters, as well as eliminating anti-tank weapons. Aircraft can halt the movement of enemy reserves. They can also take out roads, rail, and command centers and communication systems, as well as some batteries. The missions just outlined can also be accomplished more permanently by paratroops and air landing forces. The second line has the task of destroying artillery and other anti-tank defenses. The third line brings up infantry through the enemy infantry. The fourth line will be composed of tanks. The whole mighty assault must break into the enemy defenses simultaneously on a broad front and press on to objectives in a series of continuous waves. The exploiting of success by tanks will be done by motorized infantry. And some other basic maxims that show Guderian's advice are these. The shorter the artillery preparation, the better. A prolonged bombardment betrays the location and time of attack. Smoke should only be used by tanks in favorable wind conditions. Engineers must lend tanks a hand during preparations and improving approach routes. It is physically taxing for infantry to accompany a successful tank attack. They must be specially conditioned and fitted with light equipment. Tanks need both air cover and radios. Heinz Guderian also states that one of the big problems of supplying tanks is fuel and rubber. Quote, "We," meaning the German people, "are delighted to be able to say that they will cease to object to difficulties of supplying tanks so in the near future. We owe this to the comprehensive measures that have been taken in the Reich's 4-year plan." I got some bad news for you, buddy. That's not going to be enough oil. Warfare at the present day. Guderian acknowledges that the current state of permanent frontier fortifications France has with Germany, as well as the extremely difficult terrain, and how this could negatively affect Germany's chances in a war. However, he remains confident that his tactics can conquer these fortifications. Guderian gives numbers for motor vehicle production. The United States has a clear advantage in the production of motor vehicles. Guderian strongly advocates for building a network of highways and roads for military transport. The Autobahn is the primary example of this. Guderian explained how large-scale roads are necessary for modern supply and troop movement. Interestingly, the United States' highway network is based off the German Autobahn. After all, Eisenhower was the big proponent of the U.S. highway system. and he observed the German Autobahn in his role as supreme Allied commander in Europe. Guderian references the importance of learning from the Spanish Civil War and the Italo-Ethiopian campaigns in regards to tank warfare. Conclusion: Guderian concludes that the stronger the Wehrmacht is in terms of arms, equipment, and spirit of command, the more secure will be the maintenance of the peace. Now for some practical examples. 1. A campaign into the Caucasus. Here we will imagine the blitzkrieg plans Guderian would draw up if designing plans for this power here, launching an attack into the mountain region here. Assume many enemy divisions will be deployed at the border. Mountainous regions are depicted as such. Orange are tallest, yellow is slightly lower, green can be assumed to be flat. His plans would be this: send in motorized infantry on the east coast with the main goal of pinning down and attacking artillery and anti-tank weapons. Lead an armored thrust on the eastern coast here, going around the mountains. The first line of tanks should have minesweeping capacity. The second attack should be a set of paratroopers or aerially dropped light infantry. These paratroopers should attack here and clear out any obstacles. This will allow for another smaller tank attack on the western side. Trap enemy border divisions against the mountains and slowly reduce them with your infantry. Use your 2 tank armies to encircle or otherwise operationally outmaneuver second-line enemy units. Once second-line units have been destroyed, attack the capital and destroy any centers of control. This can also be done with any newly created forward air bases. But of course, the real secret to a speedy and successful military campaign is to give your soldiers meth.